Hello, AP Human Geography. Ms. Levy, we're talking about 11.4, the International Division of Labor. So when we talk about International Division of Labor, and this is a major factor in today's more global economy, whenever we talk about the international trade approach, really International Division of Labor is an end result of this idea of the international trade approach to economic development. And so what the International Division of Labor is this is when you see the relocation and the reorganization of economic activities, operations, and jobs from a national scale to a more global scale. And again, this is very closely aligned with the international trade approach model and this concept of how you see the different types of jobs in different sectors. You see it change as a country develops. So we know that as a country develops, especially using international trade approach model, you should see a shift in the type of jobs and in which sector. So, for example, we know that most LDCs, the primary sector would be where most people are performing their jobs. So remember, there are three sectors of an economy. Primary sector, which is where they extract raw materials from the earth. These are all jobs that are farming, fishing, mining, and logging. Farming, we're obviously taking agriculture and then harvesting it from the earth. Fishing, fish from or some sort of seafood from the earth, meaning some sort of water source. Mining, you're taking resources out of the earth and logging trees from the earth. So first sector is primary sector. Second sector is called secondary sector. And this is when they take those raw materials from the primary sector and they turn them into finished product. Again, from 9.1, we learned that secondary jobs would be manufacturing jobs, would also be construction jobs because they're taking raw materials and turning those into a finished product. And then finally is tertiary. Tertiary is more service sector jobs. So this is everything from retail to people who work in food services, to people who are software engineers, to doctors, to teachers, to firefighters, to lawyers, to bankers. All of those are tertiary service sector jobs. And as a country develops, you should see this shift in the type of sector that's primarily the jobs focus. So as a country shifts from LDC to DC. So as a country develops, you should see this shift from LDC to DC. So a shift from primary in LDC, where most people are subsistence farmers, to secondary, where more people are moving into the cities. So from rural to urban, so from the rural area to cities, to work in more factories and to get more skilled level jobs, because there's better technology, so they don't need as much subsistence farmers. And then better technology, meaning that they have better ways of processing food, better ways of manufacturing goods for consumption. And also because as it shifts from LDC to DC to that secondary, you tend to see more manufacturing, more factories and such locating there because they have a little bit more skill level and more investment dollars that have come in. So you see companies from MDCs and the new companies in DCs starting to manufacturing their products there. So an example would be like a company like Nike or a company like Apple manufacturing their products in China or Mexico or India. So then as we see a shift again from DC to MDC, you should see a shift where you have less secondary jobs and less primary jobs, and then more tertiary-based jobs as more people become educated, more technology available, more people getting higher level, higher skilled, high-wage jobs. Then again, you see this additional shift from secondary to tertiary. So again, that says as a country develops economically, you see this shift from primary jobs to secondary jobs, and then from secondary jobs to tertiary jobs. And that's as a country shifts from LDC to DC. You see this from primary to secondary, and then from DC to MDC, from secondary to more tertiary-based jobs. And this is as you see more people moving from rural to urban, as you get more education, as you get more technologically advanced, as you gain more wealth in your society. Next, let's talk about the key features of the international trade approach model. So we know that this creates economic interdependence and more globalization. You see this core periphery model. So this is the core periphery model basically here. This is the dependence of the core, the MDCs, on this lower cost production, the secondary sector from LDCs and DCs for their mass goods. So again, you see this more economic interdependence, more globalization, where the LDCs and the DCs are relying on those MDCs for that investment dollar and those jobs in manufacturing. And then the MDCs are relying on the DCs and the LDCs for that cheap manufacturing and those raw materials. Next, you see more advanced transportation and improved communication. So you see where time space compression, meaning that time and space, distance, and the time it takes, it doesn't matter as much because transportation improves and communication improves, meaning that China may be halfway around the world for us, but we can send an email or we can do video chat with somebody, so the distance doesn't matter. The time away doesn't matter because of improved communication. So then we can have this separation of production and consumption, meaning that different levels of the production process can be located in different countries. Like we talked about your tennis shoes, there may be 5 different countries that are involved in the production of the one pair of Air Jordan brand shoes. Maybe one part is in one country, another part's in another country. You see this concept of the comparative advantage? This means that wherever the country has that advantage over the production process, meaning they can provide the resources cheaper or the labor cheaper, then that's where it will be located. So what that means is they have an advantage over their compared competitors. Next, you see outsourcing, obviously, and offshoring. That means you source outside your country those jobs and that processing, that manufacturing. So wherever you can get that comparative advantage, meaning that it can be produced in the best way, but in the cheapest way possible, that's where you're going to locate that production. So again, if you're Apple and you can locate the production of your iPhone in a country where you have the adequate amount of workers and type of worker, meaning the skill level, and you can do it much cheaper, that's where they're going to locate. You see the profit drive. This is transnational and multinational corporations need to reduce their costs. So what is the goal of every industry? Again, that's to maximize profit by minimizing cost. How do they do that? By finding the cheapest production costs. So that's that comparative advantage. Next, they set up trade agreements in order to facilitate this process. So International Division of Labor really requires trade agreements in order for it to even be possible. Great trade agreements like NAFTA, Trans-Pacific Partnership, all of these, European Union, all of these remove barriers to trade and location of those production processes, so they can take advantage of that comparative advantage. And finally, you have this concept of you need foreign management. And what ends up happening is they locate these factories, like Apple locates their factories, say in China, but they're being managed from the United States. The processes are managed from the United States. They're not necessarily putting management in the local economy there. Let's talk about the impact on the socioeconomic structure of the United States of this international division of labor. Sometimes this can create unemployment. You know, those jobs that were in those factories in places like Detroit and Flint and Ohio and Pennsylvania and Delaware, those people no longer have those jobs because those jobs have moved to factories in places like the maquiladoras in Mexico or special economic zones in China or other areas of Southeast Asia. So you see some job loss there that can affect the middle class, those people who used to have those decent jobs, and that increases income gap. You see this, what's happening in the U.S. is deindustrialization, meaning that we are less industrial as a country. We're more tertiary based and less industrial based. So you see a lot less manufacturing happening in the United States and more service based. And you see this more profits for companies in the United States. So as they've moved their production to DCs and LDCs, what's happened is that gap in their profit, because the production cost, in order to make profit, you take your revenue and you subtract your costs. And as that revenue increases and the costs decrease, then your profit increases. Next, you tend to see more internal migration as people have to move from areas that were deindustrialized, where they've lost those manufacturing jobs. They have to move to places where there are more jobs. So you've seen this internal migration in the United States from the Rust Belt. Those are areas of, again, places like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Delaware, where they used to have a lot of factory jobs. Places like New Jersey, where they used to have a lot of factory jobs. And those factories have been closed, and the new factories in maquiladoras in Mexico and factories in Southeast Asia and East Asia open. The factories in these areas in the U.S., they are abandoned and they've been rusting, so they call that area the Rust Belt. And a lot of those people moved to the Sun Belt because there were more people moving, places like Florida, and they took up tertiary jobs. Next, labor relations. You see a decrease in the amount of people in labor unions because you don't need as many labor unions because there's less manufacturing. And you see more consumption, and it becomes more accessible. Consumption does, because the goods, the benefit to us for this International Division of Labor as consumers is that goods are cheaper, so we can consume more. Next, let's talk about the impacts of socioeconomic factors on India, China, and Mexico. They have, in those DCs and LDCs, they've had more job opportunities because as those factories have opened, then there are more jobs available there. So you see increase in incomes, and you see more gender empowerment happening there as women are entering the workforce. This means added income for their household, but also more independence for women. Unfortunately, you see an increase in child labor in some of these areas because some of these factories, they were employing child labor, so therefore those kids don't go to school. You see this wide wage gap happening in some areas where, especially where you see still a lot of subsistence farmers who don't make any money because they're farming for themselves and their families. They don't have any income. And then people who are working in these factories, and then management in the factory, and then their kids that they're educating because they now have money. You see this increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots. You tend to see a lot of migration in these countries of India, China, and Mexico. As we talked about, like Ciudad Juarez in Mexico, which is just across the border from El Paso, Texas, but in Mexico, became a major area of maquiladoras. You see a lot of maquiladoras there. And so a lot of people migrated from Mexico to that area, and that city grew a lot. But this was in order to get better jobs. And you saw this in manufacturing areas in India, and then these manufacturing areas of China. You saw a lot of problems with the environment because as factories opened and they didn't have the same environmental laws, you saw a lot more pollution and environmental impacts. Places like India, where there's so much pollution. China, they've had bad issues with pollution, and same with Mexico. Saw a lot of like regional disparity and regional growth. Some places of India, some places of China, and some regions of Mexico have grown substantially, especially where you see all these factories that have popped up. But then you have some areas where there's zero growth happening. So that's created this gap between haves and have-nots regionally within these countries of India, China, and Mexico. Finally, you see a lot of culture change in these areas because of the influence. Anytime you have outside influence from other companies and cultures and political views, then you're going to see some impact on that native culture. So differences in terms of encouraging people to learn English, people taking on more of like the values of the U.S. and European because there's so many companies located there. If you go to places like India, China, and Mexico, you go into stores or you go around, see billboards, you'll see a lot of the same people using iPhones, people listening to Justin Bieber and Taylor Swift, people who are wearing the same type of clothing that people are wearing here. So again, you see that effect on the culture as well. All right, guys, so this is the end of our presentation about the International Trade Approach Model. Thank you. And how it's affected by the International Division of Labor.